Look at these gears: predictable, sequential. When we try to understand human consciousness, we often fall back on imagery exactly like this. In traditional cognitive science, an act is defined through a strictly linear sequence. Data serves as the input, the brain processes it, and an action emerges as the output. Relying on this mechanical sequence creates strict boundaries. By treating the mind as a simple assembly line, we restrict our ability to investigate the actual depth of conscious experience, bounding philosophy within the rules of a calculator. The vocabulary of systems theory itself, inputs, outputs, processing, remains highly useful. The error lies in how modern theory applies those terms, refusing to adapt them to the messy, recursive realities of biology and metaphysics. We need a framework that retains the precision of these mechanical terms, but maps them accurately to human complexity. Clinging to a strictly linear model of input and output forces the human mind to act as a mere transactional calculator. It misses the actual mechanism of existence entirely. This text from the Metaphysics of the Conscious Loop offers a correction. The act is the input from self and the output from self. Taken literally, this states that the origin point of the data and the final destination of the resulting action are the exact same entity. Our objective is to take that premise and map it into a functional framework, maintaining analytical rigor without stripping away the nuance. To do this requires discarding the assumption that the brain sits quietly in the dark, waiting passively to receive stimuli from the outside world. When you apply this self-referential loop, action ceases to be an isolated event that starts and stops. It becomes a continuous, unbroken condition of being. By redefining input and output as inherently self-referential, we elevate a rigid mechanical structure into a profound metaphysical principle of existence. We naturally possess a bias toward the static self. We assume our consciousness acts as a fixed observer sitting inside a mental theater, watching data arrive. Look at this model. This setup demands a strict physical separation between the actor making the choice and the action being performed. This separation creates an immediate theoretical dead end. If an internal observer is required to process the input, who is processing the data for the observer? It triggers an infinite regress. Furthermore, a strictly centralized processor cannot account for continuous, real-time adaptation. If the self remains completely static, it lacks the mechanics to evolve from its interactions. Traditional cognitive science metrics often make the error of prioritizing that hypothetical central processor while treating the actual pathways of action as secondary plumbing. Treating the self as a noun, a fixed object that executes tasks, builds an artificial and insurmountable barrier between cognition and the act itself. To correct this, we take that linear sequence and bend it. The output is folded back towards its origin. This introduces autopoiesis, a system's capability to continuously recreate and maintain its architecture. Notice how the pathway is now closed. Action is not a transaction with a void outside the body. It is a continuous internal feedback mechanism. External, environmental data certainly exists, but it only becomes philosophically relevant the moment it crosses into and is assimilated by this internal loop. At this point, the centralized observer collapses. The system operates seamlessly without requiring a separate internal entity to manage the flow. The self ceases to be a localized processor hidden somewhere inside the brain. The self is the continuous loop of action itself. This expanding ink demonstrates a closed recursion. The moment you close the loop, it stops being a simple pathway and becomes a perpetual engine. This engine produces two specific forms of exhaust. The first is creation, the continuous generation of novel internal states. The second exhaust is integration. This is the immediate, mandatory assimilation of the newly completed act right back into the architecture of the self. Creation and integration are not distinct steps in a sequence. They occur simultaneously, bound to the exact same millisecond of action. This dual exhaust mechanism constantly drives consciousness forward. Because every output modifies the system, it is mathematically impossible for the entity to ever return to its exact previous state. Because every single output immediately restructures the internal baseline. A conscious being is quite literally constructed by its own actions. To see this in practice, watch this artist working the clay. We can shift our focus from metaphysical mechanics to observable human behavior. When we analyze a state of deep focus or flow through the lens of the conscious loop, the traditional input-output model disappears. In these moments, the individual is not sending linear, conscious commands to their hands. They are operating as a unified, seamless feedback loop of touch, pressure, and immediate physical adjustment. The speed of this continuous cycle removes the boundary between the subject and the action. You cannot isolate the artist from the act of shaping the clay. Therefore, the self must be categorized as a verb. It is an ongoing, dynamic process of doing, rather than a static noun that simply does. For researchers looking to analyze conscious behavior without falling back into reductionism, this gives us a concrete 3-step framework. Step 1. Observe the loop. Stop attempting to isolate a hypothetical internal decision maker. Instead, analyze the continuous stream of environmental feedback. Step 2. Track the integration. Measure precisely how a specific output immediately restructures the actor's internal baseline state. Step 3. Define by process. Direct your analysis to define subject identity based solely on the specific perpetual engines of creation that the subject sustains over time. Adopting these 3 steps moves cognitive research methodology away from mapping static, rigid architecture and focuses it entirely on mapping dynamic, active processes. Look closely at this pupil dilating, continuously reacting to the light it takes in. To truly understand consciousness, we must stop looking for a ghost hiding inside the machine. We must recognize that the conscious act itself is the architecture.